Welcome to the Slingshot. Our guest today is Erik Peinert, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Boston University, where he teaches Introduction to Comparative Politics. Erik holds a BA in Political Science from UC Berkeley and a Master's and Doctorate in Political Science from Brown. He served as research manager and editor at American Economic Liberties Project, and he's the author of the new book, Monopoly Politics from Oxford University, about the shifting pendulum between pro and anti-monopoly politics in the United States and France, which we will be discussing today, alongside Erik's latest essay in the LPE blog. Welcome, Erik, to the show.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
And as always, I've got my partner in crime, Darren Bush, with me to keep me straight on the legal matters. Darren, how's life treating you over there?
Life's treating me well in Texas for now.
Good, good. Well, let's start off with the LPE blog essay. And I realize the two topics blend together because you were giving a preview of the book in the essay, but there are some fun stuff. And there's this thesis in both the book and the essay I want to begin and try to kind of play devil's advocate here, right? I hope we can still be friends afterwards. You say that, quote, anti-monopoly politics are likely here to stay, at least for now. And I want to just gently push back with a lot of love. You know, one could argue the pendulum is swinging radically back to supporting monopolies, including dominant employers under Trump. You know, there's the famous oligarchy picture at the Trump inauguration with the big tech guys all flanked behind him. There's the FTC's withdrawal of the non-compete ban. And one could even argue that tariffs are a way to protect domestic profits. And they're tuning down antitrust enforcement, often in return for political favors. That can be understood as a way to bolster domestic monopolies. As measured by deal flow, and I don't mean to pile on, but they're really having a good time on Wall Street. Investment banker fees are soaring. I don't know if you saw my tweet this morning. And yes, I know the agencies preserve the guidelines, perhaps out of laziness, but if you don't enforce the guidelines, the content of the guidelines are largely meaningless. So why don't you make the case, against me? Why should I cheer up and see this as the glass half full?
Yeah, so that's probably a good place to start, just sort of directly push back against some of the main sources of current optimism, though. I mean, I probably have a much more mixed bag of an opinion here. But there's two things here. One, I think, I agree with everything that you've said about the Trump administration's shift back. The book is premised on long-term shifts between pro and anti-monopoly policy. And I think the Biden administration looked like a dramatic shift back towards anti-monopoly policy after 40 years or so of dormancy. And it would be pretty easy to see the Trump administration is just either eviscerating all of that or immediately pushing back. And on literal on-the-ground policy terms, I think that's accurate. In terms of the longer-term argument that the book makes and what I was sort of saying in that LPE piece, is that you can't get rid of a movement overnight with 1 or 2 or even 3 years of policy moves. The political energy in this area has shifted dramatically. I mean, starting even before the Biden administration, where much more of the top graduates in law schools or econ programs that were going into the policy side of this field were much more on the anti-monopoly side of things. You see increasing numbers of the traditional stalwart defenders of the consumer welfare standard approach, even as much as they're staying within that view, are much more, no, we need to go after big tech or this or that case, and you're just getting a lot more agreement. So the political energy is on one side, enough people have changed their mind. I think the big caveat that I'd put in to sort of agree with your criticism is Trump administration doesn't seem to really care. It sees antitrust as just another area to reward its friends, punish the people it doesn't like, or holds a dangling threat over their head and whatnot. And there's an authoritarian strongman tendency that I obviously don't like for a bunch of other reasons as well. And if that outlasts, I think your point stands. But I think if we return to anything resembling normal politics, there's too many people who recognize both the economic and especially now the political risks of letting things stand as the status quo had been, that I'm much more optimistic that it's not just going to go back to normal.
Well,
Long answer aside.
That makes you feel a little better. I can, this is my therapy session, so I feel better now. Let me try this one out on you. You also make this point in the essay about how, quote, competition creates pressure to make new products, reduce costs, and expand output. But at its extremes, it can mean market instability and bankruptcy, end quote. Now, I feel like folks in the anti-monopoly movement might blanch at the suggestion that, you can have too much competition. We've never seen it in our lifetimes, right? At least folks who are weighing into these policy debates now. It'd be kind of like convincing that Christopher Walken character in the cowbell skit with Will Ferrell that you can have too much cowbell. Like, how could you have too much competition? Now, you point to some historical examples where ruinous competition actually caused a run of bankruptcies, leading to severe suffering. And I've read about hyper competition in China recently. They even have a fancy word for it. They call it involution. We have excess price wars and excess capacity. And you give some examples in France in the 60s for sure. But have we ever really experienced too much competition here in the US?
So great question. And there's a two-part here. There's one, why like the anti-monopoly movement is skeptical of this. And I will say the anti-monopoly movement's actually somewhat divided on this. There's one camp that's like very much in the we need more competition. And I think Biden's executive order on competition was very much of that view. And then there's another camp of maybe more academically inclined neo-Brandeisians who want to emphasize much more fair competition and understanding that things like predatory pricing and things like that are in some ways excess competition used by a dominant actor, or the fact that different rules can expose weaker actors to more competition as much as other people hold on to power. But the late 19th century, when the first antitrust laws were passed, American markets were ferociously competitive, even in the industries that we associate with robber barons. Outside of the sort of rural lines that populists got so mad about, the trunk lines on the railroads were in constant price wars, and bankruptcies weren't that rare pre-consolidation. So it is something we have seen. I think we see this in a lot of industries even today. The debates about chips, for example, there's the rich side of the chips industry with TSMC, NVIDIA, and whatnot. But then there's all the legacy node chips today that caused all the shortages in 2020 through 2022. And there it's just constant price wars and insufficient profitability.
So actually, to pick up on that, to think about Saucony vacuum and the hot oil, and then the distressed coal, and all those other times that the ruinous competition and pyramiding were argued to be distressed, ruinous competition that needed some sort of cartel regulation as well.
I miss those. I miss those periods, Darren. I think those predate 1972.
I would think so. Yeah, I think so too. But I take the longer historical view, and of course, I don't remember the 1900s at all. So the other thing I wanted to ask you about, there's this tension in your book between sort of the anti-monopoly and I think a lot of people think anti-monopoly just means anti-business. And so you can either be pro-business, right? In which case you might be against antitrust enforcement, right? Or you could be anti-business and anti-monopoly. And I think go back to this piece I wrote with Mark Glick and Gabriel Lozada, where it was actually a group of kind of business, pro-business, but capital-intensive industries such as oil, tobacco, chemicals, that actually supported Roosevelt's new, NRA and the Second New Deal, and so they were invulnerable to labor's, sort of new outsized influence, but they were supportive of anti-monopoly to some degree. So, is it a fair? The tensions that you describe, it's not fair to characterize them as anti business versus pro business, correct?
Fully agree. And I'd probably even go further. And this is somewhat it's a related tension that Hal brought up with the like anti-monopoly advocates being skeptical of competition is that there's a tendency here to code these as either conservative or progressive coded, like market power as a conservative thing and competition as a more progressive ideal. And some of that's because we all come from our own political context where those things are coded that way. But that's not always the case. There were left-coded versions of market power prioritized policy around industrial policy to compete with Japan that lived in the 1970s and 80s as alternatives to the Chicago school neoliberal version. They just lost the debate. As another example that I find hilarious, just because it's so outside of the context that most of us think about these things in, when the French government, this is from the book, was consolidating industry in the 1960s, they had a very large fight with business who did not want to consolidate because they were losing all of their managerial autonomy of having all their own firms. And that was a conservative state fighting its own business in order to consolidate. So I think I'd emphasize that like a lot of these things just aren't coded the way that we often think of them as progressive competition, anti-business, and like flip all those the other way. They can be mixed and matched in a lot of ways that might not seem familiar.
Because you get that a lot online where you're like, if you don't believe in a certain, if you don't believe in the consumer welfare standard, you're anti-business, and you must hate lower prices, you hate consumers and all that. So you get a lot of that. One thing I did like about your blog post, you state Chicago's thinkers represented a near willful misreading of what antitrust law actually said or intended. And as the law professor in me says, absolutely, right? If you go back to the legislative history, you go back to the statute, a lot of us have done that work and fully agree with you. Where you don't, where I think you pull a punch though, if I can give you gentle feedback, is you don't talk about how they willfully misread welfare theory, right? So Bork misreads what Marshall and converts what Marshall said into this whatever standard of surplus, conflates that between consumer welfare, total welfare, whatever. And then it's completely abducted by a group of people who completely ignore the flaws of consumer welfare and total welfare standards. So isn't why do you think you pulled that punch, and do you think that's a fair criticism?
No, of course it's not a fair criticism of me. I got everything right. No,
How dare you, sir?
In all seriousness, I did pull that punch to some degree, but there's a reason for it. I think I'd say is that, and it's probably two layered. At one level, I am a political scientist, and so like on the finer points of welfare economics or whatnot, I'm probably not the best person to like make those qualifications. That being said, I think some of the main reason I like pulled the punch is when you talk about consumer welfare standard, if you get 20 industrial organization economists in the same room right now, you will get 22 different versions of exactly what the consumer welfare standard means. And some of those, quite frankly, are a lot more reasonable than others. The place I'd be much more skeptical is I will agree if you go back and read the original Chicago school things that were written from the 1970s and 1980s, yes, they're wild. It's like imagining that you can deduce the economy wholesale, evidence-free on the basis of 2 or 3 pages of reasoning. For the purposes of the book, most of what I wanted to show was much more that like it was foreseeable by policymakers and politicians and sort of like presidential administrations what the consequences of adopting this viewpoint would be, that they understood regardless of how it was developed. But beyond that, I wasn't necessarily focusing so much on how right they were about like how an antitrust or industrial organization economics should be focused. And I probably did pull the punch because I think today consumer welfare standard includes people who just adopt a very different worldview than the people writing in 1975.
You heard it here first. He said you should get your PhD in economics and not political science. I'm pretty sure I heard that clearly.
I want to kind of get into the impetus behind the book. And I realize this is a tough field probably for you to make an innovation, just given how much it's been hit and how successful those pieces were. I'm thinking like Tim Wu, Zephyr Teashout, Matt Stoller. And there's been a lot of books about, you know, the Chicago hostile takeover of antitrust and the pushback. So yeah, what brought you here, and how did you think you were going to come at it in this new angle?
Yeah, so the answer might actually be to flip that question on its head, because coming from political science, we have close to no literature on antitrust or competition or monopolies. Like, you may know some of these names, but Mark Eisner wrote a book 30, 40 years ago, but Beth Pop Berman's book is just a couple years ago. There were a couple things else in the early 90s. Elizabeth Sanders had a thing that involved antitrust about the era of populism. But beyond that, it's just, there's not that much. And so it's now there's me and a few colleagues of mine who like are now putting out excellent work within political science, but actually getting people to care in the field is the issue. And I also came up with the idea before this became a super live issue in real world politics. I think came up with the original idea for this in 2016 or so, reading some political science, some things in geography, and some things in economic sociology. That really just made me realize as a political economist that there were a lot of things that we're not thinking about as political scientists. But I guess I came to it from a perspective of it not actually being a very established field and having a much more open plane to come up with ideas and arguments about it.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk now about the central thesis of the book, this pattern of alternating the swinging pendulum, right, between policies favoring competition and policies favoring market power, and what drives it. So I don't think there's any dispute about the underlying fact pattern. Where I think that the controversy is, maybe that's too loaded of a term, but the debate could be what is causing that pendulum to swing back and forth. I mean, a naive theory would just be there's elections and you go from, you know, Biden to Trump. But you would, of course, poo-poo that naive theory in favor of your much more sophisticated layered theory. So what were the competing hypotheses, and how did you rule them out? How did you rule yours in?
Yeah, so great question. So just to like re-summarize, to the degree I didn't do this before, like 20 minutes ago or whatnot, you know, the core argument of the book is that policies alternate in the long run between favoring market power monopoly and favoring competition. This is mostly because doing those policies for so long generates a series of economic costs. Excess competition creates price wars and bankruptcies, as you've mentioned, and then the cost of monopoly, I think we're more familiar with high prices, low investment, et cetera. And that like a lot of the political story is about how that plays out in the state with turnover of bureaucracy and political actors. But as you point out, you know, there's other ways you could explain this. And the most obvious one, being a political scientist, is that election cycles go back and forth. You know, the Conservative Party wins, the Liberal Party wins, and they do different things. That one was actually pretty easy to rule out even before I started doing research, simply in the sense that this was mostly parties or executives changing their mind. FDR was a fan of this and then changed his mind in 1937, 1938. The Republican Party, generally speaking, was a fan of the New Deal antitrust order to a much greater degree than it shifted, and changed its mind over the course of the 1970s to when we get to the election of Reagan. And I show the same thing. It was a socialist government in the 1980s that shifted to competition in France, and center-right governments under de Gaulle the whole time that shifted to this like consolidation-based industrial policy. Some of the other arguments are about technological change, sort of the effect of sudden economic shocks, interest group lobbying. So businesses obviously have a very large amount of like preferences over these rules. And those I actually mostly went about dealing with empirically. Like when you're talking about the debates over what direction should policy take, the book is based on pretty extensive archival evidence. So I have a lot of records of when they met with various stakeholders, whether that's labor, business, specific businesses, or sort of industry associations. And you also have the records of what they thought about those meetings afterwards. In a lot of the cases where you might expect, even with policies that, let's say, helped business in the long run and current business would favor those, at the time, they were written off, or they didn't even want the policies ended up benefiting them later.
So I want to push back on this notion of a pendulum. And I don't know if you're a Miley Cyrus fan, but I view it as a pendulum one way and a wrecking ball the other way. So let me explain. So all of the power and in terms of where the ideology comes from, all the lobbying groups, the Supreme Court precedent, the bar, all advocate for a sort of restrictive view of antitrust under the consumer welfare standard. And that has been true for almost every single president except for Biden. There are no monopolization cases under Obama, barely, and I don't think we have to argue about whether, Clinton was a neoliberal. So we have this one moment in time where kind of this pendulum of Kahn and Cantor come swinging back. But I think isn't it the case this is not an equivalent pendulum? There's going to be a massive backlash that's going to be much bigger than the movement one direction.
So, I don't have a crystal ball, not to be quoting the T-Mobile judge, but so like I can't see the future here. But I think, and this is somewhat the same issue that Hal was bringing up at the very beginning of like, isn't this going to just like stop dead in its tracks? And one of the analogies I want to emphasize here, with the caveat that obviously I can't predict the future, is this is actually what a lot of the historical record and people's understandings at the time were about Thurman Arnold. Thurman Arnold and became Assistant Attorney General for antitrust in 1938 and filed an unprecedented slew of cases, mostly initially cartel cases, but then going after the biggest American industries there were, and even filing cases in the middle of the war after the US had entered, which a lot of business people and many in the administration thought was crazy. And the historical record there thought like, oh, he lost. FDR fired him, got rid of him, and like that put that to an end. And then we went back after World War II and we had the big consolidated oligopolies that Arnold obviously wanted to get rid of. And like at one level, more recent historiography has pointed out that that's just not accurate. They continued filing all of those cases under Arnold's successors through, and then won most of those cases after the war. And obviously the like golden age of antitrust for the 20 years after the war existed for a reason. And so I just say like the narrative you see, and it's not that the individual policy choices right now don't matter, but the narrative you see about like the backlash undoing the progress can be very overstated. And some of that also just remains to be seen as well.
Yeah, fair enough.
All right, I want to go back to this kind of cool part of the book, and I guess it's a history that I was just ignorant of. I just always assumed naively that FDR hated monopolies from the get-go, but you've pointed out convincingly that he actually loved monopolies before he hated them. And it's an interesting story, and it does support your thesis about how attitudes changing within an administration as opposed to elections changing things. I just read a quote from page 51 of the book. It's quote, Roosevelt came into office in alignment with a policy regime of industrial self-government, which supported various forms of informal cartels, I mean, that's yucky, patent agreements, shared price lists. We're back to doing that again through earnings calls. Fixed wage scales and a range of trade association policies to rein in destructive competition. And he did this through the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, from 33 to 35. But then they flipped things around, as you said, and they started pursuing an extensive campaign of trust busting in 1938. Now, one thing that was interesting is that it seems like the NRA failed to achieve its goal of inducing firms who are protected to invest heavily and to grow their labor force. So what was that? Well, and then there's a great, you found these pictures and you reprinted these figures that were created by economists, I guess, back in the mid to late 30s, showing that the very industries that were abiding by these price cartels, we're doing horrible jobs of keeping people employed. So what can you explain, like, what was the flaw in their thinking, and what's the mechanism that kind of caused this whole thing to unravel?
Yeah, so great. And I'm going to try to summarize this as best as I can. At like a high level, the specific mechanism and arguments you're emphasizing were part of a broader ideological frame that came into the early 1930s that saw destructive and ruinous competition as like one of the main problems of the era that had to be reined in. Um, Interesting, slightly less known story is that the NRA, as it was finally passed in 1933, was like the inheritor of a chain of bills that had been proposed under Hoover that were mostly directed at like getting rid of antitrust law or scaling it back dramatically. There's a great book by Himmelberg, The Origins of the NRA. It's like details all of those as the predecessors to the NRA. Specifically within the NRA, what they'd thought, and I went through all the records of the research and planning division there, that like they were of the understanding or sort of inherited the understanding that if firms could keep prices higher, that would mean that they maintained higher profitability and they would have the money to be able to hire more workers. And with those more workers, there would be more consumption and you get like a virtuous cycle of recovery with prices going up. And output going up, et cetera. And now Darren is squinting at me right now, understandably, because how we now think about both macro and micro and almost any of things, this is like exactly backwards in many ways.
It's like a reverse Marxist theory in a way.
Right. And like, I was skeptical of this when I was first reading this, but it very much was what they were working with as a conceptual framework. But one of the economists, who was actually a financial analyst brought in from Wall Street when the NRA was thrown together, noticed that this was pretty much backwards. As Hal said, is that, you know, the industries that were willing to cut prices were the ones who kept people employed, largely on the understanding that if you cut prices, you keep sales because, you know, in the middle of a depression, you have lower prices, you're going to get the sales. And at that time, as now, but lesser degree, like second industrial revolution, mass production technologies in like output and employment are very tightly correlated. If you get more sales, you need to hire more people at some like linear relationship to be able to do that. So that was this sort of mechanism. And through that, they saw, okay, we actually need to be pushing prices down, not up, to allow competition to like spur employment growth and output growth.
So there's another interesting part where I'm gonna pick on you a little bit. Um, you're right. If consistently favoring price competition is the aim of improving efficiency, lowering prices, and ensuring a level playing field, the resulting economy will eventually see depressed profits, price wars, bankruptcies, and uncertain investment prospects. Um, and it is these circumstances that motivated the debates over ruinous or destructive competition in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in America. Um, but wasn't if the New Deal is sort of about anti-monopoly in part, not I
Mm-hmm.
mean just a sliver. Um,
Yeah.
but there was high GDP, there was increased innovation, there was all sorts of there's improved work wage and improved wage inequality, right? Not perfectly, because of course there's racial discrimination and all that. So where's the evidence for the ruinous competition and all those other horrible lists of things that you describe?
Yeah. So great. So, like, just to be clear about what I mean about the theory before I explain what I pinpoint in that circumstance. So, at one level, when I say that these policy regimes generate diminishing returns or generate costs over time, those slowly accumulate over time. So, like, if you look at a 30-year policy regime of, say, the New Deal policy order post World War II, like, what I'm saying is you'd only see those towards the very end. And as I'm sure you know, like there was a noticeable collapse in profits in the late 1960s for American industries. There's a lot of reasons that people argue for this. One of the main ones being rising Japanese and West European competition after they'd recovered from World War II. I would emphasize that that definitely is a huge part of it, but also emphasize that the reason that competition was so ferocious and the form it took was part and parcel in some ways of the way the US had set up both the New Deal order and the trade order that it internationally projected on top of it. Just like progressively lower tariffs over time, though I wouldn't reduce that to just issues of monopoly and competition. But then at the same time, we had a bunch of antitrust rules that were both very skeptical of scale, but moreover, forced American firms to license all of their technology to these foreign competitors. And this was probably one of the main things that in the room, either in the Nixon administration, came up again in the Ford administration, even though Ford didn't listen to them. Carter administration started taking this concern very seriously, and it definitely came up again in the Reagan administration, is the fact that American firms were the most technologically advanced, even as their manufacturing base was getting like very competitive markets with a lot of bankruptcies in the late 60s through the 1980s. And at the same time, that competition was coming from Japanese and Western European companies who hadn't developed the technology, but instead were forced to, like, a forced licensing scheme, sometimes by edict and sometimes for concern of violating antitrust rules, meant that they had to share this technology that they'd put up all the upfront costs to invest in. So like that's sort of where I would make the multi-layered connections between those things. So, I mean, I think there is a certain argument that maybe trade just had more to do with it, but it certainly intersected with the way that the US and the New Deal policy order had put together everything from antitrust to trade to intellectual property.
I wanted to ask a question, if I could, on this. Could be a bit of an arcane topic for some, but for the antitrust fanatics, it's kind of cool again. This resale price maintenance, or RPM, and you spent some time on it in the book. And you explained, this was new to me, that RPM was effectively legalized in 1937 as part of the Miller-Tidings Amendment to the Clayton Act. I think this came from the same place as the NRA that we talked about before, an effort to try to, I think in this case, was to breathe life or to prop up domestic retailers, freeing them from the ruinous competition. And this legal status, I understand, wasn't repealed until 1975. So that was a nice long run in which I guess there were not many cases brought against RPM in the country. So I'm just wondering, how did it go? Did RPM, or sorry, legalizing RPM, did that work as a way of propping up domestic retailers?
So great question. So there's a couple things on this. Like, one, Miller Tidings legalized resale price maintenance in a particular way. It legalized it for state laws to allow retailers sort of amongst themselves and in conjunction with the manufacturer to set fixed retail prices to prop up retailers. The other form of RPM that was never allowed or not until recently allowed again, was for a dominant manufacturer to tell all the retailers that it sold to that, like, this is the price you need to sell at, which is why, we had, MSPs, manufacturer suggested prices, for the longest time because they weren't allowed to mandate them. And those have somewhat different effects. And like Miller Tidings certainly propped up your smaller, like, mom and pop stores because it allowed them, it frankly prohibited larger retailers from underpricing them, whether validly through efficiencies or just predatory pricing. RPM's a complicated topic. I will say, like, one of the other episodes that I think got cut or like downplayed in the book significantly is the early 80s. The Reagan administration wanted to get rid of prohibitions on RPM, which is one of the episodes where there was a huge lobbying fight because all of the big retailers wanted there to be no RPM rules so they could do all their discounting practices to sell in volume, which is how big, clothing and electronics retailers make their business. And the Reagan administration basically told them to get lost. We want to allow RPM. And like, it was eventually resolved, not through that lobbying battle, but the 1982 Monsanto decision. But like, I'm connecting this to some of the instances where there was a big lobbying fight, and even the Reagan administration went further than business wanted, who was actually pushing back against them.
Yeah, that's fascinating stuff. Well, I don't know if Darren has any more. I was going to ask kind of a concluding question, but Darren, how are you doing over there? I don't want to hog the mic.
Oh no, I've been enjoying this. It's been great fun. I was just going to ask you what's next. What are you working on now?
That's what I was going to ask you. Brilliant
okay.
minds think alike. All right, go ahead. This is it.
Great. Yeah, no. So next project, and this is very preliminary, but I am looking at related but pretty distinct issues about sort of the intangible knowledge economy and why the US and Europe, to varying degrees, have sort of gotten stuck in focusing so much on intangible capital and labor light firms and their financial performance at the expense of other things that they now say they want, a manufacturing base, like broad-based, like good jobs, and focusing on the reforms from like at the intersection of antitrust, but especially just intellectual property from that era, and how that's both distorted financial markets, how that's created sort of new categories of firms that actually don't want that domestic resilient base that we're now all arguing about. And likewise has sort of changed the policy frames that we consider these problems in to frame them in terms of the boundaries of intellectual property rather than, jobs and resilience or supply bases or whatnot. So I'm going to be looking at that hopefully through some of the world's leading industries today, chips, pharma, EVs, and whatnot. But that is a multi-year project, and I would say I dream to be able to finish it the next 3 to 4 years, but we'll have to see.
Very cool. Well, thanks so much for coming on to the show, Erik. And everyone should rush out and do exactly what I told my students. Buy a copy of Monopoly Politics. Darren, you should tell your students to do the same. And we'll take very small commissions. Very small commissions. 10% is all I ask.
Yeah, you're I think with your permission, I might have to get some excerpts from this from my I teach a capitalism and oligarchy class, which is dangerous to do in Texas, but I might want to have to use some excerpts from this for my next round.
Good. Well, if Darren ever goes missing, we know where to look now. But Erik, thanks so much for coming on, and until we see each other again, have a good day.
Yep. Thank you.